Hey there, YouTube. Before I get into the video, let me remind you that if you like my content, please hit that like and subscribe button. And also, if you feel the need to support me, hit me up on my Patreon at patreon.com/uncommonramen with a capital U and a capital R. I do all of this in my free time, so any amount of support can help me bring more of this content to you more often. Okay, so in lieu of the fact, I wasn't actually going to do this deck tech first. I had actually planned on doing a couple deck techs before I did this one, but the package that had some of the cards that I needed is still in the mail for reasons unknown to me. So I have to delay those videos. So we're going to look at Liberator Urza's Battlethopter. There's going to be all 10 swords in here, and some of them just absolutely do not make sense in this deck. It was just for the lulz. Anyway, Liberator Urza's Battlethopter is a 3-cost commander that's a 1/2. It has flash, and it also gives all of your artifacts. Actually, it says colorless spells. So it gives all of your colorless spells and artifacts flash. And that's really important in this deck because you can play on other people's turns and you can be a lot more reactionary as opposed to having to play everything on your turn. One of the biggest problems that colorless decks run into is A, any kind of spell support whatsoever, and B, having to play pretty much everything at sorcery speed. So this is very useful to the deck. It also has flying, and it gets bigger as you cast artifacts with CMC, mana value, I should say, higher than Liberator Urza's Battlethopter's power at that particular point in time. So it gets +1/+1 counters, and slowly but surely it's bigger, which makes it perfect for kind of a Voltron-y type of situation. So I think this is a perfect commander for this. We're going to jump into the creatures next. As you can imagine, there aren't a lot of creatures in here. A lot of Voltron decks don't use a huge amount of creatures. So first off, we have Brass Squire. You can tap it to attach an equipment to a creature you control. Equipment can be very slow. Even if you do flash it in, you won't be able to equip it the turn you flash it in. So despite it having flash, it really kind of doesn't matter. So having the Brass Squire kind of gives you that opportunity, if you do flash equipment in, to instantly equip it. Next up, we have Foundry Inspector. It just makes your artifacts cost less. The more reducers that you have for artifacts in this deck, the closer you get to artifacts just costing nothing to cast. And again, in a deck that has flash for artifacts, that could be really important and really disgusting. Also costs 3 to play. We got Joyous Familiar for the same reason. This one has flying, but and it says historic spells as opposed to artifacts. So historic spells are going to be artifacts, legendaries, and sagas. So again, -1 cost to them. We can get very close to 0, if not hit 0. Then we got Karn, Legacy Reforged. This guy is one that I'm just going to read out. He's 5. He's a star. His power toughness is equal to the greatest mana value among artifacts you control, which can get, I believe the highest in here is 9, but I might be wrong about that. And then at the beginning of your upkeep, you're going to add colorless mana to your... add colorless mana for each artifact you control, and that mana can be spent only to cast it can't be spent to cast non-artifact spells, and until end of turn, you don't lose mana as phases end. So I think that's really cool. He's very good. Next up, we have the Kuldotha Forge Master. You tap it and sacrifice 3 artifacts to search your library for an artifact and put it on the battlefield. This is very powerful. You can grab your Darksteel Forge and immediately pop it into play. So we got Meteor Golem in here, and the only thing I could say is that in colorless, it is very difficult to find interaction. And especially when it comes to removal. When it enters the battlefield, destroy target non-land permanent, and it's one of the few removal effects that you can use in a colorless deck. So, you know, you take what you get. Next up, we have Myr Retriever. This is 2. When it is put into a graveyard, you get to return an artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. Next up, we have Palladium Myr. It taps for 2 like a Soul Ring. Any kind of ramp like that is really good. Then we have the Scrap Trawler. Whenever an artifact or Scrap Trawler goes to the graveyard, you get to return an artifact from your graveyard to your hand that has lesser mana value. You can even try and get those cost reducers back if necessary. Silent Arbiter, only one attacker can be declared and only one blocker can be declared per turn, is really good for Voltron decks, but in general, just a good way to protect yourself. It is what it is. Sad Robot, Solemn Simulacrum. When it enters, you get to draw a card, or sorry, you get to search your library for a land, and when it dies, you get to draw a card. There's literally no downside aside from cost, and again, with cost reducers, this guy is relatively easy to get on the field. We got Steel Hellkite for removal. It's a flyer, and it has kind of pseudo fire breathing for colorless mana. But the big kicker here is you can pay X to destroy is it non-land? Yeah, non-land permanents with the converted mana cost of X. Right, we got Wandering Archaic in here. Being able to copy what our opponents are doing can really help, especially, I guess, push this deck ahead, especially if they're doing tutors, land tutors. Your opponents have to pay 2 every time they cast a spell, otherwise you get to copy it and use it yourself. Next up, we have Zenith Chronicler. I think this guy is slightly overrated. Whenever a player casts their first multicolored spell each turn, each other player draws a card. And I don't think it's slightly overrated because each other player draws a card, not just you. I think it's slightly overrated because in the number of games that I've played with this where Zenith Chronicler has been in play, I've actually gotten almost no triggers off of it. So Zenith Chronicler is supposed to be in here as a card draw engine. I don't really get all that much value out of it. I think it's kind of overrated. Okay, so that is the creatures. Next up is instants. And like I said, there aren't a huge amount of these. There's only 2. And you can imagine they are mostly focused around removal. We have Scour from Existence, which just outright exiles a permanent. And again, its mana cost is 7. The benefit here is you can exile a land if it is becoming a problem. And that does actually happen sometimes. So again, our going rate is 7. And then we have Warping Whale. This one's cool because you get to choose from multiple different things. You can exile a creature with power 1, or is it power or toughness 1, and that is somewhat useful. It's slightly removal. Sometimes there's something with toughness 1 and power absurd that you want gone. Maybe, I don't know. You can also just counter a sorcery spell, which again, it's situational at best, but we have very limited resources in colorless, so we get what we get. Or you can put Eldrazi, it's just one Eldrazi Scion onto the battlefield, which you could sacrifice for colorless mana. It's like the treasure token for colorless decks. Next up is sorceries. There are only 3 sorceries. All is Dust is in here. Because it's basically one-sided. I wouldn't say it's fully one-sided. If your opponents have any artifacts, they're going to survive that. But all colored permanents are just gone. And it's sacrificed, so it gets around indestructible. It's not exile, which is too bad. But for 7, if you think the going rate of destroying 1 or exiling 1 permanent is 7, being able to get rid of all colored permanents for 7 is actually pretty good. So I really like this one. It's probably the best sorcery, actually probably the best instant sorcery you can use in this deck. Next up is Introduction to Annihilation, and it's again exile a non-land permanent, but its controller gets a draw card. I don't know if them drawing a card is going to be nearly as useful as getting rid of whatever permanent you're targeting. And then finally, Introduction to Prophecy. For 3, we get to scry 2 and then draw a card. It's not a really good rate, but what can you do? All right, next up is the artifacts, and that is the meat of the deck. There are some planeswalkers in here, but there are just a huge chunk of artifacts, which is to be expected. And since we are looking at a Voltron deck, it's going to be a large amount of equipment. So Argentum Armor equips for 6. It gives +6/+6, and when the creature attacks, it destroys a permanent. Again, we're just trying to get as much removal in here as possible. Unfortunately, a lot of this removal is just going to sit on equipment and usually require attacks. Then we have the Blackblade Reforged. It equips for 7, but on legendary creatures, it equips for 3, and it gives the creature +1/+1 for each land you control, which is really powerful. We got Cloud Key, which is another reducer. But you can choose either artifact, creature, enchantment, instant, or sorcery. Obviously, we're going to choose artifacts. We got Commander's Plate, which the high benefit here being that it only costs 1. It equips for either 3 on your commander or 5 to another creature. And the equipped creature gets +3/+3 and protection, in this case, from every color. Next up, we have Darksteel Forge. Very important piece to this puzzle here. It costs 9, but it makes all your artifacts indestructible. We got Darksteel Plate. It has indestructible. It gives the creature indestructible and equips for 2. Next up, we have Dreamstone Heteron. It's a 6-cost mana rock that taps for 3, and you can sacrifice it to draw 3 cards if you pay 3. We got Everflowing Chalice, multi-kicker 2, and enters with a bunch of charge counters equal to the number of times it was kicked, and you can tap to add colorless equal to the number of charge counters on it. We got Fire Shrieker, equips for 2 and gives double strike. We have Forsaken Monument. Colorless creatures get +2/+2, so an anthem for colorless creatures, and it doubles your mana for anything that produces colorless mana, and whenever you cast a colorless spell, you get to gain 2 life, which I know this is really for Eldrazi deck, but how can you go wrong in this deck either? It's so good. Next up, Ghost Fireblade. Again, probably one of the biggest upsides to this is it only costs 1, but all it does is give the creature +2/+2. Its equip ability costs 2 less to activate if it so it equips for 1 if the creature is colorless. Well, what do you know? I think that was the reason I put it in here and just completely forgot about that. We got Hammer of Nazan for a lot of the same reasons that we have the Brass Squire in here. When it enters, it just immediately equips itself, and whenever other equipment enters, it just immediately equips, which is really helpful with Urza's Battlethopter giving flash to all your artifacts. It makes things in this deck seem like it's going at instant speed, which makes it a heck of a lot deadlier. Usually equips for 4, and it gets +2/+0 and indestructible. Got Heteron Archive. It taps for 2, and you can sacrifice it to draw 2 cards if you pay 2. We got Cauldron Complete. It costs 7, but again, it is removal on a equipment. It is indestructible. It gives +5/+5, first strike, trample, indestructible, haste, and a weird I don't know how to explain this ability. It's basically when this creature deals combat damage to a creature, exile that creature. If the combat damage you deal is already lethal, then that creature is not going to get exiled because the trigger from this ability is going to happen after the creature dies. Okay, so this is like a Death Touch ability, except it exiles, and it only happens if the creature lives through the combat. So it's really important that, and I know a lot of people are going to be like, no, that's not how it is. Absolutely how it works. If the creature lives through the combat damage, at the end of combat, that creature is going to get exiled. All right, next up we have Lightning Greaves for obvious reasons. Equips for 0, and it gives haste and shroud. Locks it on Warhammer, equips for 3 and gives +3/+0 and trample and lifelink. We have Mask of Memory, equips for 1 and gives the Ophidian effect. I think whenever a equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, you may draw it. No, it doesn't. It actually does way better than that. You draw 2 cards and discard 1 on combat damage, which is really good. So we get to kind of loot. We got Masterwork of Ingenuity. This is going to be one of 2 cards that kind of do the same thing, except this one only sees equipment, I believe. Copy of equipment on the battlefield. For 1, you get to copy an equipment. And there are a ton of really good equipments in here that I think this would just be perfect for. So this is just a really good card in here to get that consistency with specific equipment. Mindstone, it's a rock, taps for 1 colorless. You can sack it to draw a card if you pay 1. Then we got Mind's Eye. Unfortunately, because the Zenith Chronicler isn't all that great at drawing you cards, this actually ends up being kind of better. It costs 5, but whenever an opponent draws a card, you can pay 1 to draw a card too. It's not a good replacement for a card draw engine, but it does do its job. Got Nettlecyst because Nettlecyst is good in here. Equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each artifact enchantment you control. Enough said. This equips for 2. Mystic Forge. I think I have to read this one. You may look at the top card of your library at any time. You may cast artifact spells and colorless spells from the top of your library. And you can tap this to pay 1 life to exile the top card of your library. Basically just giving us a sort of Bolas Citadel effect without it being OP. I think it's a good card either way. Next up we have Rogue's Gloves. Equips for 2, and whenever the creature deals combat damage, you get to draw cards. So this was the Ophidian effect one in here. Plus, you need to draw cards, let's be honest. Sculpting Steel was the other thing. Masterwork of Ingenuity only costs 1, whereas Sculpting Steel costs 3. But Sculpting Steel can see any artifact on the battlefield. So equipment. I want to just double check the Masterwork real quick because I don't remember if that said that it had to be that you control. Any equipment on the battlefield. Okay, so the only difference, like I said here, is that Masterwork has to target equipment, whereas this can target any artifact. Which, I mean, typically it's going to be your artifacts, but still, copying something in this deck, really good. Again, good for consistency. Shadow Spear is just a really good card in here. It gives +1/+1 trample and lifelink, but you can pay 1 to make sure your opponent's permanents don't have hexproof and indestructible anymore. The ability to just turn off hexproof and indestructible is really important in this deck. Soul Ring, it costs 1, you can tap it for 2. Swiftfoot Boots, hexproof and haste, and also costs 1 to equip. Next up we have Sword of Body and Mind. So I'm just going to read all the swords because there's a lot of text here. It gives +2/+2, protection from green and blue, and whenever the creature deals combat damage, you get to put a 2/2 wolf creature token onto the battlefield, and that player mills the top 10 cards of their library. Equips for 2. A lot of the reason that I have these swords in here isn't necessarily for these abilities. Yes, these abilities are very good bonuses, but the protection is really important too. Just anything that will keep my creature alive, specifically my commander, is really important in this deck. Next up, we have Sword of Feast and Famine, arguably one of the best swords in the game. This one is +2/+2, protection from black and green, and whenever the equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, that player discards a card, and you get to untap all lands you control. Being able to use your lands again during your turn to cast even more disgusting things is just super good. Next up, we have Sword of Fire and Ice, arguably probably one of the better swords as well. Equipped creature gets +2/+2 and has protection from red and blue, and whenever the equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, you get to have Sword of Fire and Ice deal 2 damage to target creature or player, and you get to draw a card. I don't know if that has been errata to any target. I'd have to look that up, but even if it wasn't, even if it was just target creature or player, doing that plus being able to draw a card is super good. Next up, we have Sword of Forge and Frontier, another fantastic sword. Equipped creature gets +2/+2 and has protection from red and green, and whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, you get to exile the top 2 cards of your library. You can play those cards this turn, and you may play an additional land this turn. Just super good. Next up, we have Sword of Hearth and Home. Equipped creature gets +2/+2, has protection from green and white, and whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, you get to exile up to one target creature you own, and then search your library for a basic land card. Put both of those cards onto the battlefield under your control, and then shuffle. So we get a blink effect, and we get to search for lands. Is it basic lands? Yeah, basic lands. Super good. Then we got Sword of Kaldra. So this is the remove a creature once combat damage has been dealt to it part of the Kaldra complete. It gives +5/+5, and whenever the equipped creature deals damage Whenever the equipped creature deals damage to a creature, remove that creature from the game. And then, again, equips for 4. Next up, we have Sword of Light and Shadow. Equipped creature gets +2/+2 protection from white and black. And whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you gain 3 life and may return up to 1 creature card from your graveyard to your hand. That doesn't seem super powerful until you've played this deck a couple of times and you realize that literally everything in this deck is a target. And then this becomes actually a very useful ability. Then we have Sword of Once and Future. Equipped creature gets +2/+2 and has protection from blue and black. And whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, you get to Surveil 2, and then you may cast an instant or sorcery spell with mana value 2 or less from your graveyard without paying its mana cost. If that spell would be put into the graveyard, exile it instead. So this is the sword that I was talking about that doesn't quite fit in here. I put it in here really just because I wanted to have all 10 swords in here. There is exactly 1 instant and sorcery in here that costs 2, and recasting it just to exile it kind of just sucks because then it doesn't have any target. But Surveilling 2 is actually really useful in here, especially if you want things in the graveyard to recur for. So this half the sword is kind of nice, and the protection is really good. So next up, we have Sword of Sinew and Steel. Equipped creature gets +2/+2 and has protection from black and red. And whenever the equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, destroy up to 1 target planeswalker and up to 1 target artifact. This is great against Super Friends decks or just against pesky planeswalkers that you don't want to deal with. And also at destroying artifacts. So double whammy. Very cool abilities there. Then we got Sword of Truth and Justice. This one equipped creature gets +2/+2 and has protection from white and blue. Whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, put a +1/+1 counter on a creature you control, then proliferate. Again, very good abilities. Nothing downside here. Then we got Sword of Vengeance. This one, the equipped creature gets +2/+2, gets First Strike, Vigilance, Trample, and Haste. Lots of keywords, super good. No, it doesn't give lifelink. Oh well, but the Trample, super good. I think this is the last one. Yeah, so next up we have Sword of War and Peace. Equipped creature gets +2/+2, has protection from red and white. Whenever equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, Sword of War and Peace deals damage to that player equal to the number of cards in their hand, and you gain 1 life for each card in your hand. This is the other sword that doesn't necessarily have to be in here, but it isn't necessarily nearly as bad as Once and Future, where like half the card is completely useless. You don't draw a huge amount of cards. I can tell you that from experience. This deck does not draw a lot of cards. So half of this, where you gain life equal to the number of cards in your hand, is going to be pretty minuscule. You're probably going to gain 1 or 2 life a turn when you attack with this. Now, the other part where you deal damage equal to the number of cards in their hand also can sometimes really just depend on the deck they're playing. So I don't know if this one is iffy. It doesn't need to be in here. Next up, we have Sword of the Animist. This one is like the Hearth and Home, except that's all it does. It gives +1/+1, and except it's not on combat damage, it's on attack. You get to search your library for a base land and put it onto the battlefield. Got Thought Vessel, a mana rock that taps for colorless, but also you no longer have a maximum hand size. We got Thran Dynamo, which is another mana rock that taps for 3 colorless. We got Thran Power Suit. This one equips for 2, and the equipped creature gets +1/+1 for each aura and equipment attached to it, and has Ward 2. Yeah, we don't have any auras in here, but we have a lot of equipment, so hopefully it sees some value. And then lastly, we have Unwinding Clock, which just says you get to untap all your artifacts during each other player's untap phase as well, which can be really good with Flash. All right, next up, we're going to look at the Planeswalkers. We got Ugin the Ineffable for 6. He comes in with 4 loyalty counters, and he makes your colorless spells cost 2 less to cast, which, again, if we get to a certain point, your artifacts are just free outright. For +1, you get to exile the top card of your library face down and look at it. You get to create a 2/2 colorless spirit creature token. When that token leaves the battlefield, you can put the exiled card into your hand. And then for -3, you get to destroy target permanent that's one or more colors. Removal is useful in here, but this one is very specific to one or more colors, so you won't be able to destroy artifact or colorless permanents. And then next up we have, well, lastly, we have Ugin the Spirit Dragon, who is 8, enters with 7 loyalty counters. Its +2 is to deal 3 damage to any target. Its -X is to exile each permanent with converted mana cost X or less. That's one or more colors. So again, nice little board wipe that's a little bit more effective than the Steel Hellkite. And then for -10, you gain 7 life, draw 7 cards. Then put up to 7 permanent cards from your hand onto the battlefield, which is, if it gets to that point, your opponents might not win that game. All right, next up is non-basic lands. So the non-basic lands are actually pretty important in this deck because it's really easy to pick a bunch of lands that create colorless mana that are kind of not super great. Also, it's really easy to pick a bunch of lands that create colorless mana that come into play tapped, so just make sure you look for the right lands here. And it's one thing that I'm worried about in the Eldrazi. I don't know what their colorless lands look like, but anyway, we have Blast Zone. Blast Zone can double as a board wipe here. It enters with a charge counter. You can pay to put charge counters on it, and you can sacrifice this to destroy each non-land permanent with converted mana cost equal to the number of charge counters on here. So it's very much like the Steel Hellkite ability. And you can tap it for colorless. Bonder's Enclave. It's a draw card thing. If you have a creature with power 4 or greater, you get to draw a card for 3, which is pretty good. I think that's the going rate, right? 3 for 1 card. You can tap it for colorless as well. Buried Ruins. You can actually sacrifice this to return an artifact from your graveyard to your hand, so recurring some of the good cards in your, or good artifacts. You can also tap it for colorless. Darksteel Citadel is indestructible and taps for colorless. We got Ghost Quarter that taps for colorless. And you can also sacrifice Ghost Quarter to destroy a land, but its owner gets to search the library for a basic land to replace it. We have Inventor's Fair, which says at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 3 or more artifacts, you gain 1 life, which is kind of pointless. You can tap it for colorless, or you can sacrifice it if you pay 4 to search your library for an artifact and put it into your hand. And you can only activate that if you have 3 more artifacts. Why doesn't that say Metalcraft on it? It's weird. Anyway, we got Mikokoro. This is another one that allows you to draw cards, except this one allows everyone to draw cards at a discount. You get to pay 2 instead of 3, and each player draws a card. It also taps for colorless mana. We got Radiant Fountain. When this enters the battlefield, you gain 2 life, and you can tap it for colorless. Again, it's about making sure that it comes into play untapped. Yeah, the 2 life may seem kind of pointless, but at the end of the day, it comes into play untapped, and it taps for mana, so super good. Got Reliquary Tower, so we no longer have a max hand size. It also taps for colorless, and it doesn't come into play tapped. We have Rogue's Passage for obvious reasons. You can make a creature unblockable, and it taps for colorless, so there's no downside to that. We've got Scavenging Grounds. You can tap it for colorless. You can also sacrifice this to exile all cards from all graveyards, which can be good and bad. And I say you have to sacrifice this because it's the only desert in the deck. I suppose if you had multiple deserts, you could use that. You could abuse the crap out of that ability. But I'm pretty sure this is the only desert in the deck. Next up, we got Shrine of the Forsaken. You can either tap this for colorless, or you can tap it to add 2 colorless, but you can only spend that 2 colorless to activate an ability. I'm sorry, to cast colorless spells, and you can only activate that ability if you have 7 or more lands. It's very much like Temple of the False Gods. We've got Strip Mine. It comes into play untapped, which seems kind of unfair, but it taps for colorless, or you can destroy a land if you sack it. We got Temple of the False God, which taps for 2 colorless, but only if you have 5 or more lands in play. Which, I mean, I think this is actually a decent card. Lots of people don't like this card, but I think they're crazy. We got Mycosynth Gardens. I like this one because it actually can become a copy of an artifact that you control. But you can tap it for colorless, or you can tap 1 and it to filter mana for a color, which you won't do. But for X and tapping it, you can have it become a copy of a non-token artifact that you control with mana value X, which I think is really cool because it just continuously is a sculpting steel. We got Tyrite Sanctum. I don't know what this does actually. So you can tap it for colorless, or for 2 you can tap this to have target legendary creature become a god. And it gets a +1/+1 counter, and you can tap 4 in this to sacrifice Tyrite Sanctum to put an indestructible. Oh, so you can turn something into a god and then make it indestructible, which is actually kind of useful. That's really interesting land. We've got Urza's Mine. So this is part of the Urzatron. Urza's Mine taps for colorless unless you have the power plant and the tower in play, in which case it taps for 2 colorless. We have Urza's Power Plant, which also just taps for colorless unless you have the power plant or the tower and the mine, in which case it taps for 2 colorless. We have Urza's Saga, which this is a long one, but essentially, we do have a Saga in here. Go figure. It can tap for colorless on the first chapter. On the second chapter, you can create a Construct, which is basically a 0/0 that gets +1/+1 for each artifact you control. And then for chapter 3, you get to search your library for a artifact that costs 0 or 1. There's a ton in here, so very cool. And then finally, Urza's Tower, which creates 1 colorless unless you have the power plant and the mine, in which case it taps for 3 colorless. And then we have Urza's Workshop, which kind of just piggybacks onto those. You can tap for colorless unless you have Metalcraft, which is 3 or more. I think it's 3 or more, yeah. Artifacts in play, in which case you can tap it to add 1 for each Urza land you control and activate only, yeah, there you go, 3 more artifacts. Funny thing, if you manage to have Urza Saga at the same time, it is a Urza land. So, yeah. We got War Room. This one taps for colorless, and again, if you pay 3, you get to draw a card. And since we don't have any colors in our commander's color identity, we don't pay any life to do that, which is really cool in this deck. And then finally, we have Zulfrin Void, which just enters the battlefield to scry 1 and then taps for colorless. And then, of course, the last cards are going to be Wastes. These are the only basic lands for colorless decks, and that is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 Wastes. And that is the Liberator Urza's Battlethopter deck. Again, we were trying to go for an equipment-based deck here. So it's going to seem pretty typical artifact type stuff. A lot of the stuff in here is pretty typical for artifact decks. Yes, there are a couple swords in here you probably don't need to use, but I wanted to use them because why not? But that's it. If you have any questions or comments, leave them down below. And until next time, guys, peace.